what I'm increasingly aware of, and this is what came to whatever's left of my mind when I was looking through the notes for Ellyn von Huben. There's an inference in the remarks about a sense of transiency. And I find in many young persons that they demonstrate a transient frame of mind. And I wondered about that. I know about multiple parenthood because we see it demonstrated in the world in which we live. But I'm absolutely convinced that one cannot have stability, and it particularly applies to the young. One cannot have a sense of stability if one has no sense of belonging. And that's the difference for many young persons from me. I knew where I belonged from the moment I was born. I'm a cradle Catholic. I knew where I fitted, I knew where I belonged, and I thank God for that. And I know that Ellyn von Huben, who's going to speak to you right now, has much to reflect on, and she'll give me pause to consider my views on certain things. Ellyn von Huben.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to your North Shore from our North Shore of Chicago. It's a small world. If I had been driving the family van here, I probably could have picked up Father Andy Davy and brought him with me. It's that small a world. What I'm here to talk about right now is my conversion story, which is, unique. I think every conversion story is unique, just as every soul is unique. If you could sum up my conversion in one word, it would be grace. That's exactly how I got here today, grace, not Qantas, grace. One of my favorite authors is the late American Southern fiction writer Flannery O'Connor. And in one of her books called she wrote the introduction to a book called The Memoir of Marianne, and she broached the dilemma of depicting the lives of pious children. She had a bit of disdain for little boys who would play act mass or girls who dressed up as nuns, but she asked what's to be said of Protestant children who lack those props and have to content themselves with other acts of goodness. One answer would be me, in my youth, was a hybrid of those children. I was a pious, pagan child, unbaptized, unaffiliated, and I wanted nothing more than to be a nun. Of all the great accessories in my dress-up box, my favorite getup was my nun's habit, which I made out of a witch's cape. My mother had made it out of an old black turtleneck of my father's, but I loved using it as my veil. Just put it on my head, and I was Sister Ellyn. I grew up as sort of a nothing in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin, by virtue of its heavily German population, is very, very Lutheran. My hometown of Cedarburg, Wisconsin, had about 7 Lutheran churches, in contrast to the one Catholic parish. But I had grown up on a street populated with Catholic playmates, and I knew what I wanted. I wanted to be like them. And I lobbied furiously to my parents to be baptized. I was thrilled at the age of 7 when my mother broke down. I sort of wore her down, and she contacted the closest Lutheran church. The little town we lived in, the first 10 years of my life, was the home of the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. My maternal grandmother had been Catholic, but she left the church when she married my grandfather. She returned to the faith around the time of her death in the 1930s, but my mom and her 6 siblings were raised with no faith at all, and in fact, a bit of distrust of Catholics. My mother's older sister married a Lutheran seminarian, so it seemed natural that when the time came, we'd become Lutheran. And I remember the evening of my baptism very vividly. It was a summer evening, and I have this visceral memory of the whole event and the muggy weather, the cool church, the pastor's hands, which were so clean and pink, against his white garb. And sometimes it would make me also think of the butcher's cold, rosy fingers. If you went to the butcher shop, and trips to a real butcher shop still sort of bring back this feeling from my baptism, the butcher's fingers, clean, cold, and this feeling of blood and water. And I mean it in a good way, not in any kind of gory, weird way. And like all other Lutheran kids, I carried my catechism to school with me every Wednesday. After school, we went to our assorted parishes, and we were drilled in prayers, creeds, commandments, all the necessary things. And I would have to say the Lutheran Church did a better job of catechizing me as a future Catholic than the Catholic Church did in CCD with my own children. My children, not all of them could write out the Apostles' or Nicene creeds. And they certainly couldn't explain the difference between transubstantiation and consubstantiation. I don't think I'd even want to risk asking them that. The Lutheran discipline, and I think it's something that educators today would call the drill and kill system, was a pain, because we just had to copy things out and memorize, but it worked. The capacity to parse the difference between transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and the symbolic grape juice and bread mimicry other Protestant denominations, on top of years of indoctrination by my Catholic playmates, left me yearning for more. All the explanations of the reasonability of consubstantiation to the contrary, I felt cheated. If we were to hold up the meaning of the Eucharist to reasonable explanation, why did we need faith? And with faith, the reassurance of the presence of our Lord under the appearance of bread and wine became more, rather than less reasonable, than the explanation that the bread and wine coexist as Jesus' body and blood when consumed, only to return to their original unsacred state in the moments after communion. That is a convolution beyond my grasp. This was as frustrating to ponder as the little thimble-sized wine glasses I handled while helping my mother and her altar guild friends disassemble the elements of communion after the monthly communion service. Perhaps this is why I really have a great feel for something Flannery O'Connor said about the Eucharist. She was at a dinner party one time with all these New York intellectuals and wasn't saying much. And then some author sort of was patronizing her and turned to her and talked to her about, well, the beauty of the Eucharist. Oh, it's such a beautiful symbol. And she went on, rhapsodizing about the symbolism. And Flannery O'Connor turned to her and said, if it were only a symbol, I would say, to hell with it. She could cut that straight to the meaning. She knew that much about the Eucharist. But I do have very warm memories of my high school years in the Lutheran Church. My best friend Pam and I were given places as youth advisors to the parish council, which may not have been the wisest decision the pastor made, given our tendency to hysterical laughing fits, general benign teenage silliness. We were active and fairly devout teens, but I'm not implying that we had any kind of perfection. I still think of my friend Pam fondly during Holy Week, and we reminisce about what we called the Maundy Thursday incident. After church, a group of us girls and our moms had gone to Pam's house for light refreshments and chit-chat. Well, the moms had their coffee in the living room. We decided to fix ourselves some cocktails. Not only were we in for stern reproach for tippling at the age of 15, but doing it on Holy Thursday, and attempting to cover our crime by watering the brandy. My college search in the senior year of high school led me to a small Catholic women's college in Illinois. There was the mystery and excitement of finally being a student in a Catholic school. This school had nuns. And there was the added appeal of no required courses outside of one's major, allowing me the luxury time to explore. No required courses allowed for dabbling in a variety of subjects: art history, religious study, good stuff, fun stuff, and I must confess that my greatest academic weakness, going back to grade school, was any kind of math. Aside from basic arithmetic, I'm not real good with numbers, and in hindsight I can see that a telling moment in my schooling was being placed in a high school honors physics class. Physics uses numbers, and physics also has laws. These are solid laws that are resistant to any verbal tricks that I could pull out of the air when confronted with an essay question. I should have taken this as a sign that words were what I needed to work with, but it took a few decades before that sunk in. But I did come away with a lesson that served me well the rest of my life, and my family can attest to my frequent admonitions: do not violate the laws of physics. Just don't. If you asked me what my favorite years in school were, I would have to say 5th grade, and I'm not sure what that's equivalent to in your educational system. In the US, that's about 10 and 11-year-olds. And then I loved college. I didn't know when I left home for Barra College of the Sacred Heart in Lake Forest, Illinois, in 1973, that this really cool-seeming school with nuns was also the alma mater of my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Kramer. But things had changed quite a bit since Mrs. Kramer's day. The nuns were fewer, few wore habits. One could hardly describe as street clothes the leopard coat, stiletto heels, and rhinestone-encrusted glasses that one of the sisters wore. For student life, all I need to say is this was the early 1970s, and my school took pride in the fact that the college no longer acted in loco parentis, and we took that for all it was worth. There were no dormitory hours, there were no restrictions on men in the dorms, outside of the rule that they should be accompanied by a student. Drugs, drinking abounded. Occasionally studying was done. My parents were not aware of all the chaos I had walked into, and owing to the fact that I really enjoyed it, I was very judicious in what I revealed to them. Now, as a mother and a new grandmother, I find it all to be absolutely horrifying. At the time, though, it was like a carnival. My original plan had been to sort of work my way into their individually tailored pre-med program, but that was quickly derailed when I realized that there'd have to be mathematics. And then I took a course in Introduction to Art History, and that is what became my passion. Along with that, I had the ample opportunity to dabble in religious studies. Religious studies really expanded my spiritual horizons. I learned transcendental meditation, astrology, tarot reading, numerology, and a variety of other really necessary skills. No one warned me that astrology has a frustrating amount of math, and I consider it a grace. I couldn't deal with the calculations, and that kept me from getting any farther into it. So that's one point that my ineptitude in mathematics did serve me well. The ultimate thing was also mimes. We worked with mimes. Not that I really have anything against mimes in general. I just don't think my parents ever intended for me to be training to be a street performer. And this was miming plus spirituality, not just mimes, in a box or whatever. Mining spiritual voyages. What can I say? For my first 2 years in school, my faculty advisor was the well-known Matthew Fox. Not the television and movie actor that so many girls adore these days, but this was the Matthew Fox that many of you may have heard of for his loopy, heterodox writings, his censure by the Dominican order, and eventual abandonment of the Catholic Church. At the time, I thought Father Fox could say or do no wrong. I was one of his faithful devotees, or I could say groupie, in the most benign and harmless sense of the word. Matthew Fox is a most brilliant and gifted teacher and writer, but when he ran off the rails, he ran all the way off. I consider that another amazing grace, that my faith was not permanently poisoned by some of what went on in college. And I also sort of chuckle to think how horrified Matthew Fox would be to know the kind of Catholic that I have become. I don't think he would believe it if he knew I was standing here speaking with you today. And we also did consciousness raising, and my consciousness was really raised. We had other interesting teachers such as Rosemary Ruther and some special guest teachers, the inimitable Mary Daly. If you're not familiar with her, she's a radical lesbian theologian philosopher, or was. She's gone on to her reward. A mere glance at her Wikipedia page would be enough to curl your hair. I think it's significant that when years later, several boxes of my old college books that were in storage were water damaged, and I frantically tried to salvage them, only 2 books were permanently damaged and moldy beyond redemption. My copy of the controversial and banned in many dioceses Dutch Catechism and Mary Daly's Beyond God the Father. I think this was a sign that there are some books that just should never go back to the bookshelf. So my consciousness had been raised, so I thought, and too bad I wasn't thinking while my consciousness was going up. During my freshman year, my church at home had undergone some renovations. I, in my superior knowledge as a college student, thought they were spending too much money for a superfluous purpose. And I wasn't content to keep my thoughts to myself. When I was sent an Advent dime-a-day sacrifice folder, I returned it to my church with a scathing letter. It was slightly shorter than Luther's 95 Theses, and I told them how I could not possibly support a church that was so wasteful when there was such abounding social injustice crying out for remediation. I could no longer be part of this unjust, patriarchal, bourgeois institution. And so, quite secure in my self-satisfaction, I mailed the letter and then headed off to the bars, the bourgeois bars of Chicago's North Shore, while driving the Mercedes-Benz that my father had given me. Although, it was used and it did not have an automatic transmission or power steering, but still. And the really sad part here is that my mother was a member of the parish council, and she was privileged to be present when the pastor read my diatribe aloud. And this is an awful moment. I claim full responsibility for my idiotic, ego-driven actions, but I still wish that the pastor could have maybe discussed this a little in advance with my mother, or read the letter and said it was from Anonymous with a gentle aside later on. As if my parents needed to be told the obvious, from that time on, I never went to church. No Christmas, no Easter, never. By the age of 21, I was engaged and wanted the traditional church wedding with all its frills. Well, except that I had told my church where to go. Okay, well, pride wouldn't allow me to call the church and sort of grovel to the pastor. I was fortunate that my father had a friend who was a Lutheran pastor of another church. Like I said, there were like 7 or 8 in town. Knowing how lucky we were to have found a venue for this happiest day of our life, my fiance and I were sure to worship at this church any weekend we came home to visit my family. It wasn't easy for me because I felt kind of a disdain for those who were not only committed to going to church, but looked forward to attending it on a weekly basis. And 30-plus years later, now I can laugh. The laugh's really on me. Time and circumstances allowing, I can go to church 7 days a week and find God there at all times, body, blood, soul, and divinity. Our first daughter was born within the year of our marriage, and by our 4th anniversary, we were the parents of 3 daughters, Emily, Frances, and Bridget, and life had become real. It was no longer a theoretical school exercise. I had promised the pastor who married us that we would attend church, but one thing led to another, and it was morning sickness, then a new baby, and another, and the right Sunday never rolled around. There was a brief tour we took through several unfulfilling years as Unitarians. I don't even know how to explain that. I don't know. But in the depths of my heart, I knew where I belonged. And it took a while to get my courage up. And at this time, we were living in Illinois with my in-laws. We had 4 children. Our 4th daughter, Martha, had been born. And one morning, I guess between other household tasks, I thought, I've got to do it. And I looked up the local Catholic parish in the Yellow Pages, dialed the number before I could second guess myself, and sort of blurted out something like, I think I want to be a Catholic. And looking back, I also see other Catholic influences in my life that I didn't realize at the time. I wanted to be the best mother possible. Even though I had never really planned on having children, whenever I get into something, I sort of go at it hammer and tongs, and having these children, I wanted to do the very best. I had some problems feeding my first daughter, and so I joined La Leche League, which is an international organization that educates and supports nursing mothers. After some years of active membership, I became a leader in the organization, and during the training process, I read a tiny book that the 7 founding mothers wrote about how they came to start La Leche League. They were 7 Catholic mothers who had met at a church picnic. One of the mothers was married to an obstetrician who gave his patients medals from the shrine of Nuestra Señora de la Leche. I'm sorry, I dropped out of Spanish in college. In St. Augustine, Florida. Founded in the 1600s, it was the first shrine dedicated to our Blessed Mother in the United States. La Leche League was initially founded as a Catholic organization, and they used the name La Leche League because people were more modest in their speech back in the 1950s, and they wanted something that was sort of a code word that could be used like in the church bulletin, in the community newspapers, and so especially for patients of this Dr. White who gave out the medals, La Leche was sort of the code word. So they started it as a Catholic organization, but they eventually became more secular in order to help all mothers and babies throughout the world. But I can see how their Catholic, life-affirming, open-to-life influence came through in what I learned through my fellow leaders in the League. And I consider the founding mothers also sort of guides in my journey to the faith. My husband and I met with our pastor, or who was to become our pastor. The first thing my husband said to him, since we had 4 children, and the tiniest was with us at the time because she was just a toddler, was, well, people ask if we are Catholic, so we probably just should be. Because at the time, I guess, having 4 tiny children like that was not the most popular thing, at least in our neck of the woods. Because we had such a hectic schedule, the pastor said we didn't really have to go through the RCIA process. He would just instruct us privately. It wound up taking over a year, and it was really kind of a hectic year. We were tested, and this year was providential in retrospect, but almost overwhelming at the time. It was another time where we traversed the gamut of reality, but when we became Catholics, we were ready. The summer when we started instruction with the late Father Carroll, it turned into an awful time. My tiny little mother, not my stout big father, but my tiny little mother had a sudden heart attack, and within a week she was dead. I remember sleepwalking through the Mass on the Feast of the Assumption, praying for my mother, who was about to be taken off of life support. And the next day, August 16th, she died. August 16th is the slightly less auspicious anniversary of the death of Elvis Presley, which brought us a bit of consolation. In our grief, my sister and I found ourselves laughing hysterically because our mother was really kind of quiet and low-key, and she found Elvis to be a bit much, and the thought that she shared a death date with him was just, it was a little bit of a consolation there. And I was very surprised when my father, who had had his own little religious turmoils, and I don't have time to go into all that here, but out of his own sorrow, he had said to me he hoped I wouldn't let my feeling at being, caught off guard by my mother's death keep me from God and my family's pursuit of joining the church. And that's the kind of thing I've known really to take down people who I thought were really spiritually all together, and I didn't feel all together, but somehow I hung in there, and I feel like everyone on heaven and earth was sort of pulling for us. And In the midst of this time, after my mother's death, and we were recovering from that shock and grief, we had a car that happened to blow up. That's another story. It wasn't a bomb, it was like a malfunction. No one was injured. And it was the hottest, most miserable summer that we could remember. I found I was pregnant with our 5th baby. I could barely keep anything down on my stomach and pull myself together to get the girls off to school and do another load of laundry. To explain just how miserable I felt, one day the girls came in from playing in the park across the street, and they smelled like fresh air. It made me sick. But gradually I felt better, and the time was right, filled with energy and optimism at the end of April, knowing that the baby was coming pretty soon, and I wanted him to be a cradle Catholic. I called Father and I said, we're ready, because we had been finished with our instruction. We just needed to set the date. So on May 2nd, my childhood desire came to its fruition, and I was received into full communion in the Catholic Church, and my husband became Catholic, and our 4 little pagan babies were baptized. And I also knew that the baby who was coming very soon would be a cradle Catholic. So my life wasn't what I had planned, but it was what I had always wanted. And I was home, but the adventure was just beginning. I often hear people in the midst of difficulties and grief wondering how people without faith can manage. And that's a good question. You can survive only so much in life by toughing it out, biting the bullet, but without the knowledge of God's love and assurance that all things work for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose, there lies a path of emptiness and despair. Of course, there were moments that we had that tried our trust. We had some continuing money problems. We had lost our home in 1987 and had moved in with my in-laws, which sounds really super tragic, except that we weren't 7 people plus Grandma and Grandpa crammed into a tiny apartment. We lived in a huge house overlooking Lake Michigan. As painful as I may have found some of it, not being the matriarch of the house and things, my children still have happy memories of life in a big, crazy house, and they had a closeness with their grandparents that a lot of kids today just are not privileged to have. Our 6th baby, Eddie, the number 5 was named Charles, I shouldn't forget him. Our 6th baby, Eddie, was born at home in this house in 1993. It was a very busy time. I was a CCD teacher, Brownie Scout leader, just run around mom. When Eddie was about 2 years old, my husband became suddenly ill. He was diagnosed with something called a pheochromocytoma. I like to say that quickly. It has a certain snap to it. It's a benign adrenal tumor. If you like television doctor shows, you may be familiar with it. For some reason, doctor programs like to have people with pheos. I think it sounds good. It's a medical-sounding tumor. And also, drama comes from people who have tumors that produce bursts of adrenaline. My husband really had no bursts of adrenaline. There wasn't great drama, just 6 weeks of feeling like a single mom while he was on a drug regimen to suppress his adrenal glands before the surgery. Then there was the fact that he came close to bleeding to death on the operating table when the tumor was removed. The final words from the doctor were a mixture of that old good news and bad news routine. The bad news is that this usually benign tumor was malignant. And also, by the way, there is no chemotherapy for it. The good news was they'd removed it all, so we could go back to life as usual. I had been my son Chuck's 2nd grade CCD teacher. There's such joy in preparing little ones for the reception, their first reception of the Blessed Sacrament. And the joy is compounded when one of your students is your own child. But 2nd grade was becoming progressively more difficult for Chuck. He had developed odd behaviors, had attacks of panic and rage. After many difficult doctor appointments and hospitalization and testing, he was diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome and also Asperger's syndrome, or I guess what some people would say high-functioning autism. Because of all of his problems, we decided to withdraw him from school and teach him at home. He was not able to complete CCD and receive his first communion with his classmates. I was happy to be at the First Communion Mass with the little children in my class, but my heart broke because my son was not there. But that was selfish sorrow. Chuck was not feeling deprived, since his main problem in this instance was not being able to handle all the attention and extra stress of a special mass and all of the, sort of performance aspects that the little children went through. So we were all pleased several weeks later when he received our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament for the first time during a regular Sunday Mass. This young man has taught me so much patience, so much understanding and trust. I received great rewards, such as when he was confirmed several years later, and I had been his teacher. Our family was finally able to move into our own place in 1998. This was a smaller, more modest house in a less posh part of town, which was quite a come down for the children. We live in an area that, there's a lot of spoiled kids, a lot of money, and it's an unrealistic environment. For people who live in really dangerous parts of the world, it sounds ridiculous for me to be up here complaining about it. So it's safe, it's clean, but it has its pitfalls. So there were 8 of us in a 3-bedroom townhouse. So it was a bit of a stretch, but we're creative, kind of Martha Stewart sorts, and home is where the heart is. I carved out the perfect homeschool area where I schooled Chuck and Eddie and several of the boys' sisters at various times, depending on what was going on. Even though my Protestant in-laws were never hostile, I felt some vibes of disapproval or, misunderstanding. But once we were in our own place, I felt like I could create the Catholic homeschool of my dreams. Everything went well, even though difficult times, with one very rebellious child, I won't name names, often felt like they were killing me. Prayer and patience prevailed. And this wild child, who I once thought would wind up in jail or maybe worse, is now an honors student in nursing school and a real treasure to her mother's heart, but all my children are. When the year 2001 started, I was dragging around through life. What I see now is something maybe of a clinical depression. It took quite a while to wade through the valleys and keep on going. As I was starting to snap out of this, the horrible events of September 11th took place. That very same week, I saw a small ad in the Sunday bulletin at our parish. They were looking for someone to answer phones and do light office work several evenings a week, and some Saturdays and Sundays. I'd been proud to be a stay-at-home mom for 20-some years, but I had this feeling that the world was sort of turned upside down, all bets were off, everything was topsy-turvy, and I thought, well, maybe I should, do something. It was just a very weird time. The lovely woman who had answered the phone the day I called and blurted out that I wanted to become Catholic was now the business manager, and she decided to take a chance on me, even though I had a degree in art history, and my only real work experience was being an office temp in a steel mill, a women's clothing factory, a really useful job skills, but she took a chance on me. So for over 10 years, I've been privileged to help our holy priests in the day-to-day work of our church. I share in moments with the parishioners of great joy, great sorrow. There are some moments that are just funny and hard to describe. I had a phone call from someone who said she wanted to speak with someone. She had some questions. She wanted to talk to someone about donating an organ. And I stopped and I thought, okay, should I get a priest? Is she thinking of giving a kidney or something? Or does she have a musical instrument she wants to give away? And sometimes you just sort of have to play it by ear, and other times you just have to blurt out. And I said, are you thinking of giving us a musical instrument? And that's what it was. So, one great thing I love about working at the church, no 2 days are alike. You really have to think on your feet, and it's really a blessed experience. Here's the final link, finally, about how I got here today. After I had been working at the church off and on, part-time for about 6 months, my husband had a sudden but mild heart attack. And rather than being real concerned, I found myself feeling mad at him, not at God, at him. And I thought, something's wrong here. So I asked a very holy priest who was a resident at our parish to give me some counsel. I started seeing him regularly for spiritual direction, and when he found out that I had started blogging as kind of a hobby, I like little hobby things, and blogging is, you know, there isn't a whole lot of mess or cleanup involved, like doing glitter crafts. When he found out that I had been blogging, he said, you know, start doing some written assignments. So he'd have me read things, and rather than just talk about them, he'd tell me to write like a 2-page essay or something. Blogging was fun, but I never really considered myself to be a writer. I wasn't even an aspiring writer. I had good grades on written assignments in school, but that didn't make up for the fact that everything I wrote was like pulling teeth, and I mean really like impacted teeth. But the more I wrote, the more I liked it. And being given direction and I'll call it a mission made the writing a labor of love. Writing was not about me anymore, but about a larger message, the message of the love and truth of Jesus Christ. My spiritual director is a close friend of Father Robert Barron, who some of you may have heard of. He's a prolific American author, a teacher at Mundelein Seminary. He does a lot of speaking. He started Word on Fire Ministries to help spread the good news of Jesus in the 21st century. And Father Barron is really at the forefront of the new evangelization. The crowning achievement of his work is the 10-part Catholicism series, which is taking the world literally by storm. Father was in Australia, sorry he didn't make it over here, for 2 weeks, several weeks ago. He's going to be in England there. It's really making an impression. He wanted to do something that was the equivalent of Kenneth Clark's Civilization, only about the Catholic Church. About 2 years ago, Father Steve Grunow, my spiritual director, who's now assistant director at Word on Fire, asked me if I would like to contribute pieces from time to time to the Word on Fire blog. And he suggested my first piece, because I sort of gave him a blank look, like, okay, fine. He suggested I write about Lady Gaga, because you can tell from looking at me, you know, I'm up with fashion and stuff. But he knew I would have something to say about Lady Gaga. So I've written a lot for Word on Fire since then, besides my own blog, which is where I do more of my kvetching about my family and what the dogs have done and things like that. And then for Father Barron, I trot out some of the more solid spiritual stuff. But it was the Lady Gaga piece that brought me to the attention of the organizers of your fabulous Eucharistic Convention. And that's how I got here today. So that's the story thus far, and I'd have to sum it up again in just one word: grace. Thank you so much.
And that's the difference for many young persons from me. I knew where I belonged from the moment I was born. I'm a cradle Catholic. I knew where I fitted, I knew where I belonged, and I thank God for that. And I know that Ellyn von Huben, who's going to speak to you right now, has much to reflect on, and she'll give me pause to consider my views on certain things. Ellyn von Huben.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to your North Shore from our North Shore of Chicago. It's a small world. If I had been driving the family van, and Wisconsin, by virtue of its heavily German population, is very, very Lutheran. My hometown of Cedarburg, Wisconsin, had about 7 Lutheran churches, in contrast to the 1 Catholic parish. But I had grown up on a street populated with Catholic playmates, and I knew what I wanted. I wanted to be like them. And I lobbied furiously to my parents to be baptized. I was thrilled at the age of 7 when my mother broke down. I sort of wore her down, and she contacted the closest Lutheran church. The little town we lived in, the first 10 years of my life, was the home of the Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary. My maternal grandmother had been Catholic, but she left the church when she married.
what I'm increasingly aware of, and this is what came to whatever's left of my mind when I was looking through the notes for Ellyn von Huben. There's an inference in the remarks about a sense of transiency. And I find in many young persons that they demonstrate a transient frame of mind. And I wondered about that. I know about multiple parenthood because we see it demonstrated in the world in which we live. But I'm absolutely convinced that one cannot have stability, and it particularly applies to the young. One cannot have a sense of stability if one has no sense of belonging.
Little boys who would play act mass or girls who dressed up as nuns. But she asked what's to be said of Protestant children who lack those props and have to content themselves with other acts of goodness. One answer would be me. In my youth was a hybrid of those children. I was a pious, pagan child, unbaptized, unaffiliated, and I wanted nothing more than to be a nun. Of all the great accessories in my dress-up box, my favorite getup was my nun's habit, which I made out of a witch's cape. My mother had made it out of an old black turtleneck of my father's, but I loved using it as my veil. Just put it on my head, and I was Sister Ellyn. I grew up as sort of a nothing in Wisconsin. And here I probably could have picked up Father Andy Davy and brought him with me. It's that small a world. What I'm here to talk about right now is my conversion story, which is, unique. I think every conversion story is unique, just as every soul is unique. If you could sum up my conversion in one word, it would be grace. That's exactly how I got here today. Grace, not Qantas, grace. One of my favorite authors is the late American Southern fiction writer Flannery O'Connor. And in one of her books called she wrote the introduction to a book called The Memoir of Marianne. And she broached the dilemma of depicting the lives of pious children. She had a bit of disdain for